This is Dateline News and Conversation. Many people know about the famous Arctic convoy during World War II when the United States embarked on a Lend-Lease program to help the Soviet Union in their fight against the invasion of the German Nazi Wehrmacht. Well, this convoy sailed from Great Britain, from Iceland and North America to ports in the Soviet Union to bring needed supplies. And there were about 1,400 merchant ships delivered essential supplies to the Soviet Union. Many of them were sunk. But these convoys demonstrated the Allies' commitment to helping the Soviet Union prior to the opening of a second front, and tied up a substantial part of Germany's naval and air forces. What many people don't know, including me, that there was an air route from Fairbanks, Alaska, over the Bering Strait to the far east of the Soviet Union. Now, here to discuss this in detail is my friend and colleague, Pete Clark, a pilot himself and a permanent resident of Yakutsk in the Russian Far East, where the history is kept alive. Pete, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back.
All right, so I consider you one of the foremost experts, at least in the English language, about this really incredible feat to transport aircraft and supplies from factories in the United States, leaping off from Fairbanks, Alaska, to the far east of the Soviet Union. And one of the last stops was your city of Yakutsk. Now, tell me and our viewers about this historical context.
Yeah, okay. Well, you already mentioned that this was part of the Lend-Lease program, and the U.S. was provided the Lend-Lease program not just to the Soviet Union, but to Great Britain and China, France a little bit, although it was a little hard to get supplies to them after Germany pretty much took them over. But they were supported. Charles de Gaulle was supported a little bit. But the Soviet Union really needed the help, because all of the industrial factories and production in the Soviet Union was basically in the western part of the country. And that was the part that was under attack by Germany. And so if they wanted to continue to, put out war machinery, including aircraft, they were forced to relocate those factories east of the Ural Mountains. And this was right at a critical point in the war when Germany was at its strongest, and they were bombing the heck out of the Soviet Union anyways. And the Soviet aircraft at the time weren't really good enough to take on the Luftwaffe. So they really needed some help. And the U.S. stepped in and said, we can supply aircraft. So they did. And there was actually 3 routes that they ended up using. The one that you mentioned was the northern route, where they would take things across the Atlantic and end up, I think, delivering in Murmansk area. But there was another route through Iran, because they could cross the Pacific and get to the port in Iran that way. The problem with that is it took like 3 months for anything to get there. And so it was kind of a long way. And so Roosevelt and the Americans asked Joseph Stalin, what about we could fly aircraft from Alaska over via Siberia to you? And at first, Stalin was not very keen on the idea, mainly because anything east of Yakutsk, which is where I am right now, was basically mostly uninhabited, unexplored, undeveloped land, huge territory, several thousand kilometers, I think over 3,000 kilometers. And there weren't any roads, there weren't any airports, there weren't any weather stations, there weren't any media, any navigational aids. It was a whole lot of tundra, and that's about it, and some pretty steep or pretty high mountains ranges that had to be crossed. And the weather in this part of the world, in the wintertime, it gets pretty cold. We get here in Yakutsk, minus 60 Celsius is not unknown. We usually get there for a few days anyways. And we have probably 3 or 4 months where we're at least minus 40 Celsius. And that's the way it is in this part of the country, all the way to the far, far east. So it's pretty, let's say, not very friendly for people to live. In the summertime, the problem is it gets warm, but in the summertime, lightning will start fires and the tundra will burn, and there's all this smoke that's up in the air. So people can't see, you can't fly easily in the summertime either because you can't see. So it's not a very friendly route, let's put it that way. So that's why Stalin was a little bit reluctant in the beginning,
So
but
let's
he agreed.
so let's now talk about the result of the agreement. Uh, the planes were going to come from the United States. They were fighter planes and bombers, I believe. Uh, and the problem is, I don't think they could refuel in the air and probably nowhere fly across all those thousands of kilometers of barren land as you described, with no navigational equipment or stations, no radar, nothing. So, Pete, how the heck did the Soviet Union pull it off?
Well, once Stalin didn't tell the Americans right away that he was going to do it, but once the decision was made to build this route, they decided to build this route in October of 1941, and within a year, they had built 10 airports or airfields in basically uninhabited territory. As I was saying, they built it inside of a year, and they started once they had these first 10, they were able to start ferrying aircraft. They had to, there was sufficient range to get hopped from airport to airport, if you will. Of course, they had to get fuel to all of those airports and all of that. Now, what people don't know is a lot of the construction was done by prisoners. At that time, there was about 190,000 prisoners that were basically slave labor. We've all Americans have kind of jokingly heard of being sent to Siberia, to the Gulag. Well, that's what these were. These were the labor camps that prisoners were sent to, and they built it with really minimal. I mean, a lot of times all they had were shovels and picks and just hard labor to build the airfields out of whatever strip of land that they found to build it on. So it was a monumental feat, actually. They built the airports and they installed weather stations and they put in stations so that there'd be navigation across the route. So they started in October 1942. Now they continued to build airfields. Actually, but by the time the war was over, they had built like 26 airfields. So they kept on going even after the first 10.
Wow. I mean, talk about a monumental feat during the time that the Soviet Union was being overwhelmed by the German Wehrmacht. I mean, it's incredible witness to, I don't know what, the fortitude, the determination, the survivability of the people of the Soviet Union. Now, we've got these 10 lily pads or these 10 jump off places. You mentioned the word ferrying. So
Right,
what did you mean by ferrying? Let's get back to Fairbanks now, when we've got a
right.
bunch of military aircraft that have been flying up from manufacturing plants in the United States, and they're in Fairbanks. So these are all American aircraft. We're talking about the Soviet Union. Uh, Probably had no idea how to fly these aircraft. Probably had no idea. They probably didn't speak English at all. What? Tell me about what the heck happened in Fairbanks when the two sides finally met.
Well, um, there were some aviators in the Soviet Union that had already been flying American airplanes because remember they were being delivered by ship, um, either to Murmansk or to Iran and then flown up from Iran. So there were some pilots that had already trained on the aircraft and were familiar with it. And a lot of them did end up going to be part of the air route, if you will. But a lot of the pilots were just selected because they were war heroes. You know, they had a certain number of kills in terms of shooting down German aircraft or whatever. So they were heroes. And they decided, well, okay, if they're good enough to fly in combat, they're probably good enough to fly on the ferry route. And some of them, they just probably didn't want them to die on the front line anyways, because they'd already gotten up to become aces or whatever. But you're right that a lot of the pilots, when they got to Alaska, some of them had never even seen an American aircraft, much less knew how to fly it. And English was a problem. Most of them did not speak English. When the first group went to Alaska, there were a couple of ladies who were translators for the pilots, and that helped. And there was at least one American guy who was kind of Russian ancestry, and he spoke Russian, and he was an instructor pilot, so that helped. But they managed somehow.
Right. So here you have these Soviet pilots, many of them not familiar with American aircraft, untrained. Uh, they take off from Fairbanks, I assume, and they fly across the straits. And how do they how do they manage to find like the first little ferry point, the first little lily pad where they're going to touch down, refuel, get some food, uh, and maybe change crews? I don't. How did that work?
Yeah, the let me explain the first part. The planes got to Fairbanks or they got to Alaska, and there was actually three airfields that were used. Fairbanks is one of them. Uh, Anchorage was another, and Nome was another field that got used for the ferry route. But American pilots would bring the planes from the factory, if you would, and bring them all the way to Alaska. Now, the American system was one pilot would pick up an airplane at the factory, and he was going to fly that airplane all the way to Alaska. He probably made some stops along the way. In fact, I know he made stops along the way, but one guy would fly all the way to Alaska before he would go back to get the next one. The Soviet pilots did it a little differently. They flew sort of in hops from Alaska across the strait to, depending on the weather, there was some airports that were in Chukotka that they would land at, but sometimes they had to go a little bit further than that because of weather or whatever. And then they would land, and then another crew would be meeting them at that airport and take over the flying of that first batch of planes to the next airfield. So it was in a relay system, if you will.
So, Pete, let me interrupt you. They weren't flying one plane at a time, a fighter jet, a bomber. Were they flying like together?
Yeah, they would fly in a group. Usually they would have a group led by a bomber or a transport plane like a C-47, which the U.S. supplied a lot of to the Soviet Unions. I don't know if you're familiar with the C-47, but it's the military version of the Douglas DC-3 passenger plane, also cargo plane could be. But there's a civilian version, and then there was the military version, which was called the C-47. And so usually the group would be led by either a bomber or one of these transport planes because they had better radios and more experienced crews. So they were able to fly on instruments and navigate. The fighter planes, they would just, get in formation, wingtip to wingtip, basically, and follow the leader to the place they were supposed to go. That's how they did it.
So this repeated itself. This ferry, it was like the old, the old Pony Express in the Wild West. It'd go from one place, change the rider, and then continue on and to 10 stops or more. How long did this take, Pete?
Well, it all depended on the weather. And sometimes the weather didn't cooperate at all. So there would be planes, they would fly one leg and then they'd get stuck in an airfield and they'd, have a lot of planes parked that couldn't get out. And that happened quite a bit. So sometimes it took some months before a particular plane got all the way from Fairbanks to the end, which it was in Krasnoyarsk. That was the terminal point for the ferry route. And it could take some time.
So
If the
Pete,
weather was good, they could do it in a few days.
so this all sounds very heroic and glamorous, but you mentioned the weather was a problem. Did any of these planes go down? Were there any pilots that lost their lives, or was it just this perfect operation?
Yeah, there was let me tell you exactly. In the part that was the Soviet part, so Soviet aviation, there were 44 crashes and 113 aviators that died on the route.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
on the American side, there were also losses. There were people that crashed and died on the route also. So I forget how many. I'm sure the number's known, but I forget what it is.
So it was very expensive in the terms not only of equipment but loss of life.
Well, in wartime, military pilots understand that they're taking some risks, but the amazing thing is over 8,000 planes were delivered over the Alaska-Siberia air route, or ALSIB air route.
So let's focus on that. 8,000 American planes, bombers, transport planes, and fighter planes made it
Right.
to the front. I don't know the history of that part of the war, but it obviously made a huge difference.
Well, all in all, I think there was about 17,000 aircraft that were supplied by the United States to the Soviet Union,
Wow.
again through all three routes. So we're talking not quite half of the total that came over the Alaska Siberia route. And that that number, let me see if I have it here, represented, trying to think, it represented about 23% of the combat aircraft that the Soviet used during World War II. So about a quarter, a little less than a quarter.
Wow.
So it
Well,
made a difference.
yeah, it obviously did. And I knew the bottom line that whatever help the United States provided helped the Soviet Union not only withstand the German assault, but reverse it. Everybody knows about the Battle of Stalingrad, the modern day Volgograd, where the Soviets actually turned the corner and started pushing the German army back, and millions of Germans were lost and tens of thousands were captured. But not a lot of people know about this part of it. Um, I want to ask you now about history. Okay, we're 80 years on, and um, the history of World War II has been is being aggressively rewritten by the United States and its NATO vassals and Europeans. And that's a terrible disgrace when you rewrite history. Uh, so I want to ask you, because you're living in Yakutsk, and you told me that there's a museum there. There's also a monument of one of the planes, a reconstruction of one of the planes uh, at the airport when you leave the airport. That the museum is preserving the history of this incredible contribution during World War II. But on the other hand, you also told me that over the years as a pilot, you had a great deal of interest in a museum in Dayton, Ohio, that also was preserving the history. Has anything changed? Tell me about these two museums
Yeah.
trying to preserve the history.
Well, you're right. I think there's a deliberate attempt to write the Soviet Union out of the history books and the involvement in World War II. And what a lot of Americans don't appreciate is actually the war was effectively won by the Soviet Union after the Battle of Kursk.
Yeah.
And the Americans hadn't even started D-Day. D-Day hadn't happened yet. They hadn't even entered the real war. Now they were bombing the heck out of Germany, and of course that helped. You know, it helped attrit the industrial base in Germany, but they hadn't actually entered the ground fighting until after the decisive Battle of Kursk. And after that, the Germans were never able to mount another offensive against the Soviet Union. They were just being constantly pushed back, pushed back. They were being attrited. It was horrific if you were a German soldier, actually. But nobody wants to remember that part. And they always talk about how many Soviet citizens were killed in World War II. Well, as George Patton famously said, nobody ever won a war by dying for their country. Yeah, win a war when you make the other son of a bitch die for his country. And that's true. But the Soviet Union killed more Germans than any of the other allies. And that's not appreciated either. So it was a bloody war. Now, as far as the museums, yeah, I used to go when I used to live in Delaware, Ohio, which is just north of Columbus, Ohio. And I learned to fly there, and I had my flying buddies that would go flying all the time together. And we were all interested in aviation. And the U.S. Air Force has their big museum in Dayton, Ohio, which was only about an hour drive from where I lived. So we used to go there probably about once a month, maybe sometimes it had slipped to once every 2 months, but we went often, I would say multiple times every year. And one of the things that I loved about it was we got to watch this museum get built because they were constantly adding new buildings, new exhibits, etc. But right from the beginning, from the very first time that I went there, I knew they had a very nice wall exhibit talking about the Lend-Lease program and the Alaska Siberian air route. And I had known about it even before that, but I always liked that exhibit. And every time I went, I always looked for it. Well, they've taken it down. I forget when they took it down, but probably about 2018 or so. I forget
Oh, geez.
exactly. They took it down and then didn't put it back up. And I talked to the director of the museum and asked him about it. And I said, "How come you don't have the exhibit anymore?" And he kind of, gave me some answer that was no answer. And I mean, I know what the problem is that the U.S. has basically had this anti-Russian campaign going on there, certainly since 2014 and the coup in Ukraine. And so there you go. They took it down. Now here in Yakutsk was the midway point in the air route. It wasn't the end. It was right in the middle. But it was kind of the headquarters for the whole air route because we were right in the middle. And here in Yakutsk, the memory of the air route and the Lend-Lease program is very actively kept alive. As you mentioned, we have a museum here. We have big monument of a P-39 Air Cobra, which was one of the fighter planes that was used by the Soviet pilots. It was interesting. The American pilots and the British pilots didn't like the P-39, but the Soviet pilots loved it and were very effective using it. So they have a monument to the P-39. And the original barracks that was used for the pilots on the air route still exists and is still standing now. It's in very bad condition, and I don't know if there'll ever be any money to restore it. But right now, it's still standing, and you can still see it. It used to be the museum was inside of there, but they've moved it to a new building now.
So does the new building preserve the history? What type of exhibits do they have? Do they have that wall map that you talked about? I mean, and my second part of that is it frequently visited? I mean, Yakutsk is way off the beaten path. So um, how does it work?
Well, I don't know what the numbers of visitors there are to the museum. I couldn't tell you offhand. I don't know. They get some because I go there once in a while for sure, and I've gone with other people. They do have a pretty nice display. That they don't have the same wall display as what they had in Dayton. They have their own, all in Russian, of course. Um, but they have a very nice map that shows the route. And we haven't talked about this, but the reason I kind of got involved in this is I got introduced to a man named Ivan Nagembla, and he wrote a book. Actually, has written about 50 some books on the air route, but this is the one that I think is the most comprehensive. And I knew him. I got introduced to him from my mother-in-law, who knew him because she also writes books. So, there's sort of an author's clique here that know each other. And she introduced me to him. And he knew that I was interested in aviation and the air route. So he presented me with this book. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. Uh, but I had told him that I would translate his book into English, and I've been working on it. It's not quite ready to go to the publisher yet, but I'm getting close, and hopefully I'll get that done soon.
Wow, that's really interesting. What's the title of the book? What will the title be in English?
The history of the uh, air route, Fairbanks, Yakutsk, Krasnoyarsk.
Okay. Boy, I hope you do well in that. I hope you get it finished, because I think it's going to be an important contribution. Uh, now, uh, I visited several museums, military museums in Moscow, the huge World War II Memorial Museum. I don't remember anything about the air route. Um,
Did you go to Monina? Did you go to the Air Force Museum in Monina?
no, no, I didn't. I didn't. Do you know if it's
Yeah.
preserved? The memory is preserved there?
Well, some of the airplanes are there that they've still got them. Preserved is kind of a word I wouldn't necessarily use. Last time I was there, a lot of the aircraft, not just the American ones, but a lot of the aircraft were not in real good condition, I would say.
But did they
And I
preserve the memory?
understand,
Did they preserve the memory of this air route in any way? With a wall
well,
map or different displays?
in Monina, no, not that I recall. I don't recall ever seeing it in Monina. I'm not sure if in the Red Army Museum if there's such a map or not. I don't remember.
Yeah,
I've
that'd
I've
be
been there
interesting.
several times, but I don't. When I've gone there, I usually go there for the Gary Powell exhibit,
Okay.
Powers exhibit.
So I want to finish on this note, uh, because when Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in Alaska earlier this month, um, a very big thing was made about Putin visiting the graves of, I think it was 9
Right.
Soviet pilots who died, and uh, I don't know, another 4 Soviet personnel. And the video showed Putin laying flowers at each of the tombs. Uh, it was very impressive, but I thought, uh, historically, in light of what we've been talking about, it was very significant. What are your thoughts on that event?
Well, I was very moved by it, and I think I sent to you just before the summit was going to take place. RT went to Fairbanks and went to the memorial for the ALSIB air route there, and there were three flagpoles, one of which was supposed to have the Russian flag, and the Russian flag wasn't flying, which I was pretty upset about. But I guess when Putin showed up in Anchorage, the flag was put back up because RT ran another story with pictures that showed the same memorial with the Russian flag flying. So I don't know if it's still flying today. I'm not in Fairbanks, but
Let me ask you this, because you're a pretty astute geopolitical observer. What do you think the significance of that really was? Putin visiting the grave and laying flowers there. Was it just a propaganda stunt, or do you think there was some real significance? I happen to think there was some real significance to that.
well, I think there's great significance in what he did, but it wasn't just a PR stunt. I think if you follow Vladimir Putin, he lays wreaths and flowers on the tombs of the war dead, probably everywhere he goes. Actually, I mean, I see pictures of him doing that all the time. Certainly, all the time in Moscow with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, but I think in other places too. He visits, when there's a cemetery with war dead from World War II. I think he visits, and I think for him it's very personal, and it's not a fake thing for him. So I don't believe it was a PR stunt, and actually I don't know that he even was wanting it to be publicized. He just wanted to do it. Now, is it significant? Yes, because I think it's a great reminder that Russia and the United States have worked together on a number of occasions to solve major geopolitical crises, and certainly World War II was one of them. And the Soviet Union and the United States were allies, and together they defeated Nazi Germany. And we're in another war right now where we need to defeat some Nazis, but they're in Ukraine. So I think it was very significant and very moving. To be honest, I cried when I saw the picture.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it was a propaganda stunt at all. I don't know what Russia would have gained by that in the eyes of Russians or even Americans, really. Uh, but I think for me, and I agree with everything you said, you and I both know that Putin has been speaking often and publicly about the crime of rewriting history. He personally has been excluded from the Normandy annual events, which back when it first happened, I forget what year it was really kind of a scandal. And the United States and the West, ever since then, as we mentioned earlier, have been trying to rewrite history to kind of whitewash or erase the Soviet contribution to that war. And so I know that, and you know this, that Putin has made efforts in the Russian educational system to make sure that students today in elementary schools and in universities are properly educated in the real history of World War II and the last 80 years, which have been completely distorted against the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. Pete, thanks for the education. Thanks for the information. This is, I know I'm very grateful to you because I never knew anything about it. And it just shows for me, another aspect of the Soviet Russian ingenuity and resilience in defending the motherland, not in attacking somebody else, but in defense of the motherland. I can't thank you enough, Pete.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And I'm sure we didn't answer all of the possible questions about it, but anytime.
We'll leave all the rest of that to your translation. So get on your horse and get that
Well,
finished.
well, I can tell you, Ivan, again, I mean, you think I'm an expert. I'm not. I just translated his book. But, of course, when you do that, you learn something. But Ivan was really uh, deep, deep, deep in the subject. And if there's anything to know about the uh, the air route, he knew it, and he had all of the documents, and he had done tremendous research. I mean, he got his PhD thesis basically on the
Well,
history of that.
I can't wait to get my signed copy whenever it's finished.
Well, we'll see if you can't get one of these days soon, I hope.